Excellent. So thanks, Jared, and good afternoon to everyone online as well. For those who haven't met me before or don't know me from the previous webinars that we've done, I'm the founder of Movement, and we're a small team of consultants, and we specialize in decarbonising transport. That's the only projects that we do, with a particular focus on heavy vehicles, so trucks and buses. I think the title of this whole webinar is really pertinent, solving the freight decarbonisation puzzle, particularly given Mark Hammond's last slide there. It's a bit of a depressing view looking at how the emissions are going to increase, and we're really going to struggle to offset even just the growth in those emissions. And I think it's really important to highlight that we're not going to solve that challenge or that puzzle without a critical piece of that puzzle. And for us, that is energy efficiency or energy productivity, because not enough has been done in that space, either by government or by industry. And there is a huge opportunity there to, if you look at some of the papers out there, that's probably the biggest opportunity in terms of abatement by 2050. So that's where I'm going to focus on. I'll just make sure my slides are advancing here. Don't need to spend too much time on this. Is almost a bit of a recap, different perspective of what Mark just presented in terms of what's happening with emissions. The blue line, here's 2023. This is the whole truck industry, so articulated and rigid trucks. It's going to increase. Zero emission trucks aren't going to offset that. We need to do something else. And, it's really important to understand, even in 2030, 80% of those trucks that are being sold, probably around about that mark, are still diesel trucks. And it's probably somewhere between 95 and 90% of all the trucks on the road. So very sobering. So what else can we do? We need to do more than just rely on those zero emission trucks. And I guess the first place to start is really look at, where do emissions come from? What causes emissions? And at risk of oversimplifying this, there are just three factors here. We drive vehicles over distance. Those vehicles use energy, and that energy has a carbon footprint. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And so the solution for each of those, we've got to address the cause of those. We either drive less, we carry more stuff, carry more freight, and use less fuel to do that, or we switch to lower carbon fuels. And so this session that I'm presenting is very much focused on what fleets can do. If you've caught one of the previous webinars we focused on what freight customers and shippers can do, and Dave's going to talk about that a bit later on. So I'm very much focused on what fleets can do. In this blue bucket, there are some things they can do. There's less talk and less consideration of that, because you talk to fleets that carry stuff, and they don't typically talk about driving less because they want to drive more. That's more revenue, right? But there are some things around route optimization and consolidating loads and backloading that are real opportunities. And then if we look in this orange bucket, which is where I'm kind of focused on today around energy productivity, I won't go into all of these on this list. We've got some other slides coming up, which I'll take you through, but really some categories around driving the vehicle, how you manage those vehicles in your fleet, things like maintenance and so forth, and then some technical opportunities around tires and aerodynamics and so forth. There are some really viable opportunities there. And then fuel switching, which I'll focus on less. Mark's just spoken about some of that. We do a heap of work in that space as well, but I wanted to talk about efficiency today. So if we take this orange bucket of opportunities around energy productivity, these segments around here, I've got half a dozen different, I'll call them categories of opportunities that could actually have 5 or 6 different things in them, some of them even 8 or 10. And what they show is that there are different areas around a truck. This is a semi-trailer, one single trailer. We can do a similar picture for a rigid truck with slightly different numbers, but there's, up to 10%, maybe slightly more, in terms of fuel savings, energy savings through optimized aerodynamics. And that includes both the trailer and the truck itself. Tires are the only thing that comes into contact with the road for a truck. Well, hopefully, because that's all you want to come into contact with the road. But there's probably somewhere around 5% in terms of energy savings. Again, that varies by application. That's a really critical thing. All of these savings vary depending on what you do. And then there's some driveline opportunities, turning the truck off when it doesn't need to be running and idling. That can save a little bit of fuel. Hybrid powertrains is a huge opportunity, as is feedback to drivers. And look, driver training on its own, if we undertake and a training program, as opposed to just a bit of digital feedback through the cab, that can have a fairly significant impact. Something like 15% is what we've seen in case studies. And then there's probably a dozen other opportunities, right? So the point here is to say individually, there's sort of 5 to 20% at the limit individually for any one of these categories. You start combining them and they kind of cannibalize each other a bit, but they're still additive to some degree. So there are some significant savings depending on what the fleet has done already. Critical element down here is, if this is a diesel truck, every bit of fuel we save is a cost saving, and every one of those litres of fuel that we save is also an emissions reduction. So that's a really critical element for an industry that has a lot of operators that are very low margin and struggling to invest in some of these technologies. So we talk about costs, and I'm going to offset costs against emissions reductions. And if you follow that formula up here, if you can still see it, the green is fuel switch, the orange was energy productivity, and the blue was system optimizations. From an emissions perspective, the fuel switching has a huge impact, obviously. This graph comes from our white paper that we published in November last year. You can look that up. You can find a bit more explanation of this. Some of those energy productivity opportunities around driver training, hybrids, they don't save as much emissions. In fact, some of these are relatively small contributions. But if we look at the flip side of that, which is what is the cost premium, the cost to implement that saving, they're also relatively low cost. And so the saving that you get in dollars and emissions is actually can be quite cost effective for some of these things. And I think that's a really critical element, because if we don't focus on that and we don't go through that step of the journey, then just trying to jump to these big savings from technology switches, that hasn't happened in any other market. Every market that we see has gone through a big push on efficiency first, and other sectors have as well. One of the questions we often get is, if we add up all those savings, how far could a fleet typically get in terms of the emissions reductions? We've done work in emissions programs in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tassie, all up and down the East Coast, both through government programs and directly for fleets. And we reckon the average fleet probably has about 10 to 15% fuel that it could save that's going unrealized through really cost-effective measures, things, what we call low-hanging fruit. I know that probably sounds counterintuitive, but that's our experience. And if you look overseas, that's the experience in other markets, even though they're well ahead of us in terms of energy efficiency. For an average fleet that we're talking about, I'm going to say, let's be conservative here. Even if we exclude driver training, just fuel efficiency measures, it's 10 to 15, let's say 15%. Electrification, I think there's probably about, that's that 1 in 15 trucks on the road could potentially be electrified at the moment. Renewable fuels that Mark spoke about, so particularly renewable diesel, but even biodiesel as well, you can get up to a 10% saving with very little changes within the organisation. And some of those optimization measures around network efficiency are probably 5% around backloading and mode shift and so forth. So you add all that up and you end up, with a pretty big number around 35%. As I said, it's not purely additive. But even if you take renewable diesel out, because right now it's either very expensive or you can't get it, it's 2 to 3 times the price of diesel, you're still talking about a 25% saving, which is significant. And for most fleets, we think that's probably about right if they were to adopt quite ambitious targets. That all sounds quite hypothetical because they're just numbers. So let's look at a real example. This is a fleet we worked with, about 36 trucks in a local pickup and delivery operation. They spent about $500,000 a year on diesel. And we worked with them to identify some savings. They wanted to focus on 3 opportunities. One was improved route optimization. The other one was reducing idle time on trucks, because their trucks were sitting around a lot of the time just idling for no reason. And then they looked at hybrid trucks for, I think it was 3 new procurements that they were doing. We looked at what the costs of those things were and what the savings were. And this graph here shows on the left-hand axis is the annual savings from these measures. The right-hand axis is just the cumulative cash flow benefit, which is this green line. And anything below the 0 line is obviously a cost. And so you can see over 5 years, it's about $180,000 in fuel savings for what was a relatively small capital outlay. And then I guess that's the key thing in these energy efficiency measures is some of it's actually just behaviour change. There was only one CapEx item there. And look, there were probably 4 or 5 other things we identified that they chose not to go down that path because they were just early on their journey. It's one example, it's an anecdote, but I guess it just proves the case that, these are real numbers and fleets out there are missing some of these opportunities. The other question we get asked a lot, and I've just got one more slide, is where do we find information on this stuff? We are working with industry to try to get some of that information more broadly out there to fleets. There's some of it kind of scattered around the internet. The risk is that the fleets don't know where to go and they don't necessarily trust it. One of those initiatives we're working on is with NatRoad, which represents kind of small and medium-sized fleets, or all fleet operators. But we developed this initiative with them around identifying what those fuel savings and emissions reductions are and getting fleets to invest in those. So mapping out the process that they would follow and then supporting that with guidance around each step of that process. And that's half the resources, which are now freely available. If you jump on the NatRoad website, search decarbonisation, you'll find those for free. And there's a whole bunch of other suite of resources coming in to replace that. And I'll finish there because that's a good place for people to go and find those that information.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Just want to pick up one thing, the aero kits there. If I'm not mistaken, the new regs have come through to make aero kit upgrades more feasible in Australia now. Is that correct?
Don't know what regs you're talking about that would make it more feasible.
As in, we could adopt technology straight from Europe there. Kit upgrades and things like that, or is it some other upgrade?
There was a change in width regulations, which would allow some of that stuff, particularly if it is going to make the vehicle wider. But how much did we get, Mark, in that upgrade?
50 millimeters, so 50 25 the side. But it does mean that, a lot of those aerodynamic devices that previously were being deleted from trucks that were coming to Australia because of our fairly narrow vehicle width can now actually stay on the truck. So, I think that's quite important.
I think the other bit that I probably didn't focus on was most of that stuff in the orange bucket, the energy efficiency, energy productivity, doesn't rely on new truck sales, right? So if you've got a fleet and it's in this 10-year-old truck and it doesn't have that stuff on it and it suits the operation, you can go out there and get those components now and you're not waiting on this turnover of the fleet, which is relatively slow. We've got a really old truck fleet. So like renewable diesel, it applies to the entire fleet, every single truck on the road, not just aero, but tyres in particular, although rolling resistance tyres is another one. And so decarbonisation becomes much quicker through mechanisms like that.
And it looked like the biggest bang for buck was on driver training. Well, sort of how long is that a program like that take? Are we talking months of driver training or years? How does that work in practice?
The driver training is really interesting. Or influencing drivers. Think of it. I'll try to do this really briefly. Think of it as a spectrum, and right down one end, you've got things like in-cab indicators that tell the driver that he should change gears or that he's driving in the wrong RPM band, right? He's driving in the red band instead of the green band. And then you progress through all kinds of driver feedback, driver scoring in telematics systems, all the way right up to very hands-on driver training through multiple rounds. Because if you do it once, people tend to learn stuff, improve, and then forget about it, and they slowly drop off their performance. So you've got to go and do that repeatedly. But that spectrum includes lots and lots of different things you can do. And we've worked with fleets as well who share some of those fuel savings that the drivers achieve with the drivers so that acts as an additional incentive to actually get them to drive more efficiently because then they earn a bonus at the end of the month or they're in a competition or something. But look, it's a very wide spectrum. It includes direct training, which could be a couple of hours in the cab, once every month, once every couple of months. Or an intensive course on a weekend, all the way down to just having an app on your phone that gives you a score at the end of your trip.